Hi there and welcome to another video. This time I wanted to talk about an aspect of colonization or a component of colonization that I believe is completely overlooked, or at least mostly overlooked throughout our education. What I'm going to be talking about I got from this book, once again, which is an absolute gold mine of information, and I can highly recommend it. It's called Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. So when we talk about colonization normally, what comes to mind or what we tend to discuss are kings, explorers and armies, like Columbus, the crown, or conquistadors with swords and loose morals. We tend to focus on the individual actors and kind of blame them or say, oh, they did it, it was these guys. But what if I told you that behind every cannon that was fired and behind every ship that set sail, there was another force pulling the strings, making all of this conquest and all of this colonization possible? This invisible force that was pulling the strings was not a monarch, it was not a general, it was something far more modern. It was shares. Yes, the same kind of shares that you would be using in order to buy some Tesla stock, for example. In this video, I wanted to dive into an almost forgotten truth: how the invention of stocks and joint stock companies actually didn't just fund the colonization but enabled it. And without them, much of what we call the age of exploration might never have happened. Let's start with the version that is probably what you were taught in school, and that is that brave Europeans basically set sail into the unknown in search for adventure and in search of spices, basically. Now, these were some of the real motivations for people, but here's the thing: ships were expensive, so are the crews and so are the cannons. And when a single trip could end in shipwreck, mutiny or dysentery, who in their right mind would finance the whole thing on their own? The answer is almost no one. No one would do that without being able to spread the risk. Already during this time there's basically no one around with this much cash at hand. And with the added enormous risk, good luck finding anyone that is gonna finance such an endeavor on their own. Finding someone to do that would be close to impossible, and the colonization would never have been able to be conducted the way it was. Now this is where the joint stock company comes in. This was a revolutionary idea which enabled you to buy a small piece of a very big and dangerous project. You would not be launching the ship yourself, but you might be entitled to 1% of its profits, or 10 or 20, depending on how much you invested. This concept was so brilliant in spreading the risk and enabling or facilitating the finding on investors that it in turn also enabled the craziest of endeavors. The author in Sapiens brilliantly explains how this changed everything. In the 1600s, the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company were able to sell their shares to the general public. Investors would then pool their money, and this would fund the voyages of exploration and ultimately of the exploitation as well. If the ship ended up coming back with spices, gold, or even slaves, it meant that everyone ended up getting rich. And if it sank, which was a real possibility, then it meant that the people only lost their slice of the investment. The risk had now been distributed, and this is what made the scaling empire possible. And I would argue that this concept is basically what allowed some of these very small nations in Europe to almost conquer the entire world. This concept that unlocked huge investing potential had a lot more influence in the colonization than any of the single actors that we tend to learn about and that we always think were the reasons for the colonization. We often blame the monarchs or the generals, and they definitely deserve some blame, like, don't get me wrong. But those ships, all those settlements, all those slave ports, they were not funded by kings, they were funded by investors. Colonialism, in the end, was just a business, and the fuel for this business was the shares that normal, regular population here in Europe could buy and could invest in. If we take the Dutch East India Company, for example, This might have been the world's first truly multinational corporation. It had ships, it had forts, it even had armies, and it was completely funded by shareholders. These shareholders might just have been pretty regular people sitting in taverns in Amsterdam that were buying into these violent dominations of the Indonesian islands. Not because they were some evil masterminds, but because they thought the return on investment looked pretty good. Very similar to the way that nowadays you might look at Tesla stock or Nvidia stock and say the returns look pretty good. What I want to highlight is that the infrastructure of modern finance didn't just happen to grow alongside the colonization, but it was actually what enabled it. So when we talk about the brutality and the violence of colonization, why do we always seem to leave this part out? Why don't we ever talk about the shareholders? Maybe because they weren't really on the ships, they weren't really building any of the forts, and they weren't actively enslaving anyone. They were back home and they were just checking their numbers for their investments, but make no mistakes, they were the fuel of the actual colonization. Every conquest was a quarterly report for the company, and every slave ship was a potential dividend payout. And for the companies and for the investors, the morality didn't matter as much as the margins did. And the thing is that these financial mechanisms still haven't gone away. The legacy of these joint stock ventures still kind of echo throughout our world, with corporations that span continents and offshore investing and whatnot. But this also doesn't mean that they are necessarily a bad thing. This concept of stocks and owning a small part in a big project is also what allows us to invest in innovation and things that we need that would otherwise be way too expensive for a single person to try and develop on their own. And these are things that we desperately need often, and they are a true force for good in the world as well. So it completely depends on how you use this concept of investment. And the fact is that most of us today interact with stocks pretty regularly, even if it's indirectly and we don't intend to, through investments or through our banks or through pension funds, for example. And it generally feels pretty harmless. That's also because most of the time it is pretty harmless. But I bet at the same time that back in the day during the colonization, the people that were sitting in the taverns discussing their investments, they also felt pretty harmless. And the point is also not from the author to really make stocks or investments seem like any bad thing. They clearly aren't inherently evil, but the point is that people can be evil. Stocks, they have also allowed us to build cities, railroads, cars, and develop medicines, and the amount of good that we have been able to achieve through this concept of investment and shares and stocks is almost immeasurable. The author just wants to show that behind every system is a kind of story as well, and the story of investments or the story of the stock market isn't just Wall Street and IPOs. Some of its history is also cannon fire and enslaved people and resource extraction. And if we forget about that, we always have the risk of repeating this. So the next time someone wants to talk about the age of exploration, and maybe they talk about it like it was this age of curiosity and courage and exploration, maybe it's worth to ask them who even financed this stuff, if they have any idea, and who was the driving force behind it. It wasn't just kings and governments, it was shareholders that were the fuel for this kind of endeavor. And maybe the story of all these great empires isn't just about great men doing great things, but more about ordinary people making pretty ordinary investments in a very extraordinary system that ended up also causing an extraordinary amount of harm. Now that was all from me today. Thank you so much for your attention and for making it to the end of the video. You could always consider subscribing and giving this video a thumbs up. And you could also not do that. It's completely up to you. But thank you, and I'll see you next time. Bye.